At 23:45 on October 19, 1942, Lieutenant Robert Lynch crouched behind the wheel of PT-48, watching 3 Japanese Daihatsu barges cut through the black water off Cape Esperance. The humidity was suffocating, a thick blanket of tropical heat that made the air feel like steam. Lynch wiped sweat from his eyes. He was 26 years old, a veteran of 14 night patrols, yet he had 0 confirmed kills. His crew was exhausted, their skin covered in salt sores and jungle rot, waiting for a victory that never seemed to come. The barges were moving 60 troops and ammunition to reinforce Guadalcanal. They were ugly, functional vessels, armored with steel plates thick enough to stop rifle rounds and armed with Type 92 heavy machine guns. Lynch had 4 Mark 8 torpedoes mounted on PT-48. Each torpedo weighed over 2,000 pounds and carried a massive TNT warhead, capable of breaking a destroyer's keel. But they had a fatal flaw. The minimum depth setting was 10 feet. The Japanese barges drew only 5 feet of water. Lynch knew that if he fired, his torpedoes would pass uselessly underneath the enemy, churning through the water while the Japanese soldiers on board laughed. By mid-October 1942, Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 3 had lost 6 boats in the waters around Guadalcanal. 17 sailors had died. The pattern was simple and tragic. PT boats detected Japanese barge convoys, attempted torpedo runs that missed, and were then shredded by Japanese return fire. Their twin 50 caliber Browning machine guns were devastating against wooden fishing boats, but against armored Daihatsu barges, the rounds simply sparked off the steel plate and did nothing. The tracer rounds would ricochet wildly into the night sky, a visual testament to their futility. The Japanese called this supply run the Tokyo Express. It was a masterpiece of logistics. When American aircraft made destroyer runs too dangerous, they switched to bargas, slower, smaller, harder to detect, and immune to PT boat torpedoes. They hugged the coastlines, hiding in the noise of the surf, invisible to radar until it was too late. Squadron commanders at Tulagi were desperate. Some crews mounted single-shot Army M337mm anti-tank guns on their bows, lashing them to timber planks with rope and wire. It was a crude solution, one shot, manual reload. Better than nothing, but barely. PT-2109, commanded by Lieutenant John Kennedy, used one in August. It worked, sort of. But manual reloading a breech loader while Japanese machine gun bullets splintered the deck around you was not a sustainable way to fight a war. The real problem was mathematics. A Daihatsu barge could carry 60 fully armed troops or 8 tons of supplies. The Japanese were running 20 to 30 barges per night. That meant 1,200 fresh troops hitting the beaches every single night. To stop them, PT boats had to sink multiple barges per patrol to disrupt supply lines. Single-shot guns could not do that. They needed automatic fire. They needed a weapon that could chew through steel plate like a chainsaw. 3 miles inland sat Henderson Field. It was a graveyard of American air power. Wrecked aircraft lined the runway apron, destroyed by daily Japanese bombing raids, and the brutal attrition of jungle operations. Among the wreckage sat dozens of Bell P-39 Arakabruce. The Aerocabra was a strange aircraft, hated by many pilots, but loved by engineers for its quirkiness. The engine sat behind the pilot, driving the propeller through a long shaft that ran between the pilot's legs. This unusual design created space in the nose for something remarkable. A 37mm Oldsmobile M4 automatic cannon firing through the propeller hub. This gun was a beast. Could fire 150 high-explosive rounds per minute. It used a 30-round horseshoe-shaped magazine and had a muzzle velocity of 2,000 feet per second. It was devastating firepower packaged in a compact mechanism. The pilots often complained about the gun jamming in high-G maneuvers, but on the ground, stationary, it was a terrifying weapon designed to crack tank armor. On October 20th, Lynch walked Henderson Field at dawn. The air smelled of aviation fuel, rotting vegetation, and cordite. He counted 23 wrecked Aerocabras. Some had been there for weeks, overgrown with vines. There were total losses. Wings sheared off by crash landings. Fuselages broken by bomb shrapnel, but the cannons were intact. Hydraulic recoil systems, feed mechanisms, barrel assemblies, everything needed to make them work was sitting there, rusting in the tropical heat. Lynch stood next to a wreck, looking at the cannon protruding like a steel finger. He ran his hand over the cold metal of the barrel. He did the math. 150 rounds per minute. Automatic fire. Explosive shells. Looked back toward the water where PT-48 waited at Dock 3. He had an idea that was unauthorized, dangerous, and brilliant. If he could get this gun on his boat, the balance of power would shift. At 14 o'clock hours, Lynch approached Commander Alan Calvert, commanding officer of Squadron 3. There were no forms for this. No procurement system, no official channels, just a simple question and a desperate need. Calvert looked at Lynch, then at the stats of lost boats. He nodded. "Don't ask permission," he effectively said. "Just make it work." By 1630, 4 PT boat crews were walking Henderson Field with cutting torches and wrenches. They had until nightfall. The Oldsmobile M4 cannon weighed 213 pounds without ammunition. The hydraulic recoil system added another 40 pounds. Total weight of a complete gun assembly was approximately 280 pounds. PT-48 was an Elco 80-foot boat with a wooden hull. Navy engineers had calculated deck loading for machine guns, not for a 280 lb automatic cannon firing 150 rounds per minute. The recoil alone could theoretically crack the deck frames. Technical Sergeant James Coogan, an aircraft armorer who knew every bolt of the P-39, led the salvage team. Removing the cannons was brutal work. Cockpit of a P-39 sitting in the tropical sun was an oven, temperatures reaching 120 degrees inside. They had to disconnect hydraulic lines, charging cables, and cut through engine mounts. The steel bolts were seized from heat and corrosion. They needed penetrating oil, but Henderson Field had none. They used aviation gasoline, pouring it over the bolts and waiting 20 minutes for it to seep into the threads. The bolts came loose barely, screeching with every turn of the wrench. By 1730, they had removed 3 complete M4 cannon assemblies. Each lay on the coral beside the runway, looking like alien artifacts stripped from their shells. Coogan inspected them with the critical eye of a master mechanic. One had a cracked recoil cylinder, useless. Another had a bent feed pawl repairable with a file. The third was pristine. But a cannon without a mount is useless. PT boats had no mounting points designed for aircraft cannons. The bow deck was flat plywood over oak stringers. Lynch needed a pedestal mount that could absorb recoil forces and survive the flex of a planing hull, hitting waves at 40 knots. If the mount failed, the gun could tear loose and kill the crew. Chief Machinist's mate Donald Frey designed the mount in 40 minutes using a grease pencil on a sheet of scrap aluminum. The design was simple because it had to be: a steel base plate, a vertical pipe section, and a rotating collar made from scrap landing gear. Frey's team started welding at 18:15. The generator kept cutting out because of fuel rationing. Diesel was more precious than gold. They welded in bursts, cursing the darkness and the mosquitoes. By 21 o'clock hours, they had a crude pedestal mount. It was ugly. The paint was scorched, and it wobbled slightly, but Frey swore it would hold. They trucked the weapon to the dock. Lynch's crew drilled through the PT boat's deck with hand cranks. It was back-breaking work, drilling through layers of mahogany and oak. It took 2 hours. By 1:15 on October 21st, the base plate was bolted down. They lifted the cannon into the yoke. It fit. It rotated. It looked monstrous on the sleek deck of the PT boat, a weapon that clearly didn't belong there, yet looked perfectly at home. There was one final problem: ammunition. The P-39 used a 30-round horseshoe-shaped magazine stored behind the cockpit. PT-248 had no ammo racks. They simply stacked 6 loaded magazines on the wet deck beside the gun. In combat, a sailor would have to hand-feed them while the gunner fired, exposing himself to enemy fire to keep the gun fed. At 2 o'clock hours, PT-248 became the first boat in the U.S. Navy to carry an aircraft automatic cannon. It had taken 9 hours from salvage to installation. It had never been test-fired. The crew had no training. But the Japanese were coming. PT-48 departed Tulagi at 22 o'clock hours. Gunner's mate Second Class Harold Mitchell volunteered to operate the cannon. He sat on an ammo box, exposed on the bow, with the strange aircraft gun pointing into the darkness. The sea was calm, the only sound the muffled rumble of the Packard engines. At 23:55, radar picked up 4 contacts. Lynch closed in. Doctrine said to fire torpedoes at 1,000 yards. Lynch ignored it. He drove PT-48 to within 800 yards. The lead Japanese barge spotted them and opened up with its heavy machine gun. Tracer rounds zipped past the PT boat, hissing as they hit the water. Lynch didn't flinch. He held the course steady, giving Mitchell a stable platform. Mitchell pulled the trigger. The 37mm cannon roared, a rhythmic thumping that vibrated through the soles of their boots. The muzzle flash lit up the entire bow deck white, blinding the crew for a split second. The recoil shook the boat, but Frey's crude mount held. The high explosive rounds slammed into the Japanese barge. The first three punched through the steel armor like it was cardboard. The fourth detonated inside the troop compartment. The result was horrific and spectacular. The barge didn't just burn, it disintegrated. The fuel tanks and ammunition stores on board cooked off instantly. Orange fireballs rolled across the water. Mitchell ripped the empty magazine off and slammed a new one on. 8 seconds to reload. He fired again. The second barge tried to turn away, its engine churning the water white. Mitchell put 22 rounds into it. The barge exploded, a massive ammunition cook-off visible for miles. By the time Lynch broke off the attack, 2 barges were destroyed and a third disabled. Mitchell had fired 90 rounds. The gun hadn't jammed. The deck hadn't collapsed. 0 American casualties. The smell of cordite hung heavy over the boat, a scent of victory they hadn't tasted in months. Lynch radioed the results to Tulagi. Transmission was brief, but electric. It works. By dawn, every PT boat commander wanted a cannon, but Henderson Field only had 23 wrecks. Over the next week, crews stripped every salvageable gun. Teams got faster. What took 2 hours now took 55 minutes. They became experts at cannibalizing the dead aircraft. Chief Frey refined the mount, adding bronze bushings from aircraft wheels to make the rotation smoother, eliminating the wobble that had plagued the first prototype. Ammunition was the bottleneck. The magazines were designed for 30-second dogfights, not sustained naval battles. Ground crews at Henderson Field hand-loaded magazines around the clock. Each magazine required 8 minutes to load. Fingers bled from pushing the heavy shells into the spring-loaded clips. It was a logistical nightmare, but nobody complained because the guns were saving lives. The impact on the war was immediate. Japanese radio intercepts spoke of devil boats with aircraft guns. The psychological shift was massive. Japanese crews who had operated with impunity were now being hunted. They stopped laughing. They started hugging the coast even tighter, terrified of the flash in the dark that meant their armor was useless. By November 1st, 8 boats in Squadron 3 had the cannons. They'd engaged 23 barges and destroyed 14. The stats were undeniable, but they were running out of wrecked planes. When Motor Torpedo Boat Squadron 6 arrived in December, they found Squadron 3 dominating the waters. They wanted cannons too, but the graveyard was empty. The solution came from an unexpected source: New Caledonia. A supply ship arrived with 12 brand new factory M4 cannons intended for aircraft repair. Catalina flying boat crew, sympathetic to the PT boaters' plight, diverted them to Tulagi. No salvage required, no cutting torches. Brand new guns in grease-packed crates. Commanders sent a classified dispatch to the Bureau of Ordnance in Washington. It included the drawings of the improvised mount and the combat stats. Usually, bureaucracy takes years. But the numbers were so compelling, the sheer volume of enemy tonnage sunk, that on December 7, 1942, the Bureau authorized official production. Back in the Pacific, tactics evolved. PT boats hunted in pairs, one using the cannon to suppress fire, the other closing in to finish the job. They learned the anatomy of the Japanese barges, learning exactly where to hit them to trigger fuel explosions. By 1943, the innovation crossed the ocean. The factory-made M9 cannon, a naval-specific version, entered production. It was heavier, with a longer barrel and higher muzzle velocity. By January 1944, new PT boats rolled off assembly lines in New Jersey and New Orleans with 37mm cannons already installed. The makeshift welding of Donald Frey was replaced by precision factory machining, but the DNA of the weapon remained the same. The weapon that began as a desperate midnight salvage operation was now standard issue for the U.S. Navy. The effectiveness of this modification cannot be overstated. Post-war analysis showed that PT boats without cannons destroyed an average of 0.3 vessels per patrol. Boats with cannons destroyed 1.8. They were 6 times more effective. More importantly, American casualties dropped by 60%. The cannons allowed the boats to kill from a safer distance. By the end of the war, these devil boats had destroyed over 800 Japanese vessels, preventing 48,000 troops and 6,000 tons of supplies from reaching the front lines. That is the equivalent of 3 full army divisions that never made it to the fight. Japanese commanders acknowledged the impact. Vice Admiral Takeo Kurita noted that from November 1944 through January 1945, forces in Leyte lost 73% of their barge convoys to PT boat attacks. The Tokyo Express had been derailed. The men behind it, Lynch, Coogan, Frey, and Michelot, turned to civilian life. They were engineers, mechanics, and factory workers. Lieutenant Lynch commanded PT-48 through the Solomons Campaign, earning the Navy Cross. He returned to Philadelphia as an electrical engineer and died in 1978. Technical Sergeant Coogan spent the war maintaining the cannons, training over 200 gunners' mates. Chief Frey, who sketched the mount on a piece of aluminum, received no official recognition during the war. He worked in a shipyard in Washington State until his death in 1991. Gunner's mate Mitchell fired that first shot. He survived 42 patrols and later worked for Boeing. Of the 531 PT boats that served, only a handful survive today. If you visit PT-617 at Battleship Cove, you will see a 37mm cannon mounted on the bow. It sits on a factory standard mount, but if you look closely at the design, you can still see the lines of Donald Frey's grease pencil sketch from that desperate night at Henderson Field. The weapon's development path was unusual. Most systems follow a standard process of design, testing, and procurement. The 37mm cannon followed none of those steps. It began with desperate crews cutting guns from crashed aircraft, welding crude mounts from scrap steel, and proving effectiveness in combat. Only then did official channels respond. The timeline from first combat use to factory installation was 18 months. By bureaucratic standards, remarkably fast. By combat standards, painfully slow. PT boat crews needed the weapons in October 1942. They got them by building them themselves. The innovation succeeded because it solved a real tactical problem with available resources. Japanese barges carried troops. American torpedoes could not hit them. PT boat crews needed a weapon that could. Wrecked aircraft provided that weapon. The crews simply connected the need to the solution. Commander Alan Calvert authorized the installation without higher approval, risking court-martial if it failed. The Bureau of Ordnance deserves credit for validating the field results instead of punishing the unauthorized modification. The 37mm cannon became the most successful field-modified weapon adopted. By the Navy during World War II, the lesson transcends the specific weapon. Innovation in combat requires commanders willing to take risks and crews willing to experiment. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer, you're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served in the Pacific. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching. Thank you for making sure Lynch, Mitchell, Frey, and Coogan don't disappear into silence. These sailors turned crashed fighters into naval weapons.